France's Interior Minister calls it a bid to intimidate. Since Sunday night, attacks have targeted penitentiaries with machine gun fire, spray paint. Cars have been torched, including outside a prison guard's home. Hitherto unknown groups issued threats over the social medium Telegram. It's early days, though, for investigators. We will ask who done it and the context. The right-wing Interior and Justice ministers, both, by the way, with presidential ambitions, both talking up strong-arm tactics to crack down on increasingly violent and emboldened drug gangs, gangs which last year shocked France with a deadly ambush on a prison convoy that enabled the getaway of the since recaptured kingpin Mohamed Amra, also known as the Fly. So what to make of plans for 2 French super prisons for narcos, calls for stiffer sentences for small-time pushers, even one politician demanding a U.S.-style Guantanamo detention center in the French islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon off the coast of Canada. Mass incarceration has its limits, by the way. Remember that France already has some of the most overcrowded prisons in Europe. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking who is attacking the prisons of France. With us, Richard Verly, France correspondent, columnist for Swiss newspaper and website Blick. Good to see you.
Good evening, Francois.
Welcome, Gabrielle Stargarder, chief France correspondent for the Reuters news agency. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
From Lyon, in the center of France, Florence Laufer, director of Prison Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
And from Berlin, we welcome back political violence risk consultant Yann Saint-Pierre. How are you?
Doing good. Good evening. Thank you for having me.
You can always listen, that's right, listen, like, and subscribe to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Yeah, 21 vehicles spray painted or torched, most in the Marseille area, but the attacks taking place across the country since Sunday night. Coordinated attacks, say investigators. Camille Knight has more.
Torched cars outside yet another prison, this time in the southern city of Tarascon. 9 facilities have now been targeted since Sunday night, including this one in Toulon, where assailants fired at the prison doors. The anti-terrorist prosecutor's office is taking charge of the investigation.
It's a serious intimidation. They're clearly trying to see if the state will back down. I think we need to take a very firm, calm, and determined approach. With this new drug trafficking law, we are putting in place an unprecedented prison regime.
One thing the attacks have in common, an inscription left at the scene that reads DDPF, which in French stands for Defending the Rights of French Prisoners. A group with that very same name was created on Telegram just a few days ago. It posted overnight that its members were not terrorists, but here to defend human rights inside prisons. They denounce what they call humiliating body searches, as well as overcrowding, an issue also raised by prison officer unions.
So the situation is tense because we currently have 82,000 inmates, 62,000 spots, so a deficit of 20,000. We also have a decline in staff numbers. We're currently short of 3,000 staff in French prisons. The staff is both in shock and tired, and one day or another things are going to snap, either inside the facilities or outside its doors.
Figures released by the Justice Ministry last month show French prisons have never seen such a high number of inmates. The Council of Europe, meanwhile, ranks France as the 3rd worst European country when it comes to prison overcrowding.
Okay, so no claim of responsibility. However, as we saw in that report, this Telegram channel that appeared with hundreds of participants, it showed some violence, called on prison guards to resign while it's still time. The message... I don't know what this tells us, Gabrielle Stargarder, but the message filled with grammar mistakes. I noticed, I picked up on that. And again, using those initials, DDPF, the acronym for Defense for the Right of French Prisoners.
Yeah, I mean, it's a group that just cropped up somewhat out of the blue. It was created the day before the first wave of these attacks. And I think, you know, given that these initials were daubed across some of the prison sites, investigators are looking for links between the group and the perpetrators. The group doesn't really claim responsibility, but certainly there's enough to believe that there may be some link there. people are looking into it, but it doesn't seem like there's any clear sort of direct perpetrator yet. Investigators are looking into perhaps groups from the hard left. The Justice Minister thinks it's more narcos angry at these harsher prison sentences that they're pushing. But as far as we can tell, there's no clear direction yet.
No clear direction yet. Richard Verly, what conclusions do you draw?
Well, when you look at the way it was conducted, those ambush, for example, I believe in Toulon, they were spraying the door of the jail with AK-47 because the bullets were found. And when you look at the acronym, prisonnier français, French prisoner, if this was the ultra-left, I have the doubt about the F. Normally this group, the anarchists or the ultra-left, they don't put French prisoner, they put prisoners, they don't specify French. So there are a certain of things for which I tend to believe more the narco scenario than the political one.
Florence Laufert, did you see this coming?
No, I cannot say that we saw this coming. I say that it's a very concerning series of attacks, which in a way is a symptom of a very concerning situation. Rights in prisons are undergoing severe violations for quite some time. The overcrowding is very severe and is constantly increasing. So the situation in prisons is concerning. But of course, we had no idea these attacks could come, and we have even less idea where they come from.
Yann Saint-Pierre, if you were whispering in the ears of investigators, where would you tell them to look first here?
I think what we're seeing with the DDPF looks more like a false flag type of action. I think if you take the last year or 2 years in France, there have been really the actions of organized crime have been so obvious, whether it's in Lyon, as you mentioned, Toulouse, Paris. I think there's enough information in there to try to sort out patterns, attack patterns, intentions that could have maybe or could hint as to the motivations behind this. And in this sense, I would really, there are always obvious suspects for this, but the biggest issue is if we look at the history of such attacks in other countries where such attempts at intimidation occurred, it always backfired against organized crime. So at some point, it's either a desperate attack or somebody is doing a miscalculation. And therefore, somewhere along the dynamics of the last year and a half, 2 years in France, there should be enough information to indicate as to where these attacks could be coming from.
So hang on, are you suggesting that there's two specific phenomenons that we're witnessing? One, the attacks, and two, the claim of responsibility, or not exactly a claim, because that's what you said, Gabriel, but on the other hand, that there's somebody who's using this for a false flag operation?
I think, as your correspondent mentioned quite accurately, there are too many indications within those statements that don't fit with the current the type of violence. Just the word right doesn't droit in this sense doesn't fit into all of this. And I think what we're seeing, and I think it's very important to know, is both the length and the scale of those attacks. Where I think at some point we're dealing with partly coordinated attacks since Sunday. By the same time, there's this copycat phenomenon that we've seen elsewhere, is that once attacks start happening, that people start joining in, people that weren't originally involved in the process, but see now an opportunity to carry an attack on their own. And that tends to blur the picture a bit. And I think we're dealing with a conflation of dynamics right now that had a very specific and constructed and structured origin, but now has more moving pieces within it. And I think that the Telegram channel with a few hundred, that just seems too obvious at this point in time, I think.
So too obvious? So who's behind the false flag operation?
That's a very good question. I can't speculate on this right now, but we know there are, whether it's state, whether it's organized crime, whether it's other types of organization that in the past have tried to create a certain degree of dissension using other names, other profiles, other patterns. And again, DDPF simply does not fit in terms of the patterns, exactly what your correspondent mentioned, the type of violence we're seeing, the high degree of violence that we're seeing with an organization that is fighting for the rights. Usually you have a clearer, more direct, liberation of prisoners or of French prisoners. It would be more forthcoming, more assertive. But speaking for defending the rights, this has a lot more civil society touch to it, and therefore sounds more like a construct than a proper movement per se.
Actions speak louder than words. Gabriel Stargarder, again, when you look at what's been happening 3 nights in a row, and what we saw, again, written on social media.
Yeah. I agree that there are sort of certain conflicting trends going on behind this DDPF group, things which seem to rule out the other. For example, the Kalashnikov used against the Toulon prison is not the calling card of hard left groups. And then this idea of coordination between narcos. I mean, the sort of lawyers and people who I've spoken with who deal with those sort of people say that that's a very unlikely scenario as well. So one thing that we chased down this morning was the idea of perhaps foreign interference. We spoke with a senior security official here in France who said at this stage there's no evidence of foreign interference, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that they are actively chasing down. It's really a big mystery at the moment.
That would be quite a sophisticated operation, Richard Verlier. Again, we saw the map a minute ago. It's all over France.
It's all over France, but more in the south and more in the vicinity of Marseille, not too far from Marseille. And those are jails where normally you have a high number of narco traffickers. And again, I don't know whether we can see once again the telegram message, but we saw it very quickly, and I noticed a spelling mistake. Gardien démissionné. Gardien démissionné.
Yeah, wrong tense.
So if this was the radical left, normally when they do such a statement, they don't do spelling mistake. So I have doubts about the nature of what's going on. Has it to be sophisticated? I'm not too sure.
Because you heard Yann Saint-Pierre saying that in the past, when organized crime has done this sort of operation, it's backfired.
Well, for sure. I mean, whenever organized crime is doing something, it backfires because the police react. But what they are looking for is to impress and to make the people working in the jails afraid. That's what they are looking at. What they want is to make the community afraid. The cities where those jails are sitting, and especially those 2 cities where the high security jail will be for drug traffickers, they want to make the community scared. They want to make the prison officials scared as well. And they want to show to prison officials that they know where they live and they can access the parking and burn their car. So to me, that type of intimidation, that type of very aggressive operation could be the signature of narcos. Yes, it will backfire, but those people are ready for that type of police action.
Yeah, let's talk about what you alluded to. France still in shock after the recent capture of accomplices of Mohamed Amra, accomplices who killed 2 prison guards last year at a toll booth in Normandy during the transfer of the prisoner known as the Fly. Long on the run, France's most wanted, Amra eventually apprehended. There you see him in Romania at the start of the year, and his sort of cocky demeanor as he's taken by Romanian police back to his plane to France. That shocked people. The Fly now getting, as the saying goes, that free room on board at the maximum security facility of Vendin-le-Vieil. It's in northern France, one of 2 narco prisons, Richard Verlier was alluding to a minute ago, that the Justice Minister, Gérald Darmanin, has eyed for the country's 200 most dangerous drug dealers in France. It'll be ready for the end of July. Darmanin, who's recently been to Britain into a factory in the north of Paris that's that's building 3,000 modular prison cells to increase jail space. So more prison space in the works. A special narco prison. Florence Laufer, will you connect that with this?
Well, let's go to this idea that Gérald Darmanin is proposing of a narco prison and a very harsh, high security system, because he was inspired and he declared his inspiration by the Italian system. He actually went to the prison of Rebibbia And the Italian system that he's referring to was called the carcere duro, and it's the 41 bis special regime that was put in place some time ago for prisoners that were charged with acts of terrorism, those with organized or mafia crimes. It's interesting to know that this system has a number of features that Darmanin is aspiring to replicate in France: constant surveillance in solitary confinement units, severely controlled possession of personal belongings, and also very tight monitoring of all the communications with the outside. What's interesting to know is that in Italy, this regime, which is called the ergastolo ostativo, was actually condemned by the Constitutional Court, which declared it unconstitutional. And that it's also severely reproved by Europe's Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which says that segregation measures are in themselves inhuman and that beyond 24 hours, it's not feasible. So if there is an issue of gangs and violence inside prisons, and if there is problem outside, harsher measures and further violation of the prisoners' rights cannot be something positive. The French National Preventative Mechanisms, the Controller General of Places of Deprivation of Liberty, reacted to this suggestion, and it said it's going to be a factory for madmen. You cannot survive this kind of solitary confinement long. This breaks completely your spirit. And those kinds of people in prison will eventually come out. So it's very concerning, not only for their rights within, not only for the working condition of the staff, knowing that it's the harder the conditions, the more inhuman also their working conditions are, but it's also very concerning for society as a whole when prisoners come out.
But there's, of course, Florence, the court of public opinion. Again, the case of those prison guards shot during and killed during a transfer, that has people asking, citizens, voters asking for vengeance.
Well, vengeance in itself is not an item of democratic states and the rule of law, and that is one of the issues around prisons, is that prisons should be about justice, should be about maintaining the order, and indeed the murder of 2 prison staff is extremely sad and extremely tragic. What's less known and what's less told in the public is the fact that those kind of spectacular prison breaks are actually extremely rare. The vast majority of escapes in France are people that just don't turn up at the end of their temporary release. So you cannot read the statistics of prison breaks and say that all of them have that level of violence, even though the violence is actually very concerning and very sad. What's concerning in answer to that is the reaction to prison breaks. And it's been observed that throughout all countries, but in France specifically, after a prison break, the conditions become increasingly harsh. The little times of freedom inside the prison to go to activities are all closed down. And that further increases the frustration of people inside prison. Now, one other issue that would be interesting to know is the number of suicide in prisons in France, and that is extremely high. And amongst the prison staff, suicide levels are also pretty high. So that's something that should be put in the balance when it comes to the dysfunction of the prison system. And it shouldn't be just the answer of a revenge. It's more a symptom of a system that really needs to be assessed.
Yann Saint-Pierre, you've been appearing on this panel for a decade, back when we had those wave of terror attacks, and panelists were all denouncing the fact that the French penal system has people who come in as delinquents and come out as criminals or radicals. That was a decade ago. Again, I ask about the current public mood in light of what you just heard there from Florence Laufer.
There's always this discrepancy. I think there's always this notion of hard justice, of people wanting the system to work, and that criminals, hard criminals, traffickers, drug dealers, rapists should be severely punished. At the same time, there's this interesting paradox that some of the most streamed series are about organized crime. They're about robbers. They're about narco traffickers, and so on. So there's this love-hate relationship when it becomes real. And I think what we're dealing with those dynamics is that we often deal with short-term decisions without looking at the long-term data. Those super prisons, I'm going to use an example from Quebec, from Canada, where I come from the 90s and early 2000s during the biker wars that were pretty heavy. Also, prison guards were killed with a part of that war. And once the Hells Angels boss, Maurice Boucher, was arrested, the Quebec government invested at the time, saying more than $5 million building a super isolation facility for that one person with very limited effect, because at the end it came out that despite the heightened surveillance, despite everything else, he was still able to get some messages across, still have a degree of influence and whatnot. I think, and we saw it, if we link that to the IRA, the situation in Belmarsh wasn't necessarily better. So there's always this a specific prison ecosystem that provides a false degree of justice, and at the same time, that justice system has very, very peculiar needs, both to reform prisoners that could be problematic, but at the same time, having to deal with the political imperatives that say, yes, we're here, we stand for justice, we stand for punishment when citizens deviate from their behavior. And that balancing all these factors is extremely difficult.
And there are pendulum swings if you look through the generations. Sometimes in favor of more mass incarceration, sometimes less, sometimes harsher, sometimes not. Florence Laufert, let me just ask you, because you have this Prison Insider putting out this prison life index. When it comes to France, you find the conditions are harsh. A question that people often ask, why does France have some of the highest incarceration rates in Europe and some of the highest sentences for crimes of EU member states?
Yes, so we published at the end of 24 the Prison Life Index, which evaluates the living conditions of people in prison and evaluates them by with regards to the human rights and minimal standards. We evaluated 12 countries, and France was one of them, and we evaluated 5 main dimensions. The first is eating, sleeping, showering, basically the material conditions, and then we have medical care, being protected, being active, and being connected to loved ones and connected to society. And France, for all of these 5 dimensions, had a note that is C-, which means frequent and serious violations. And that's not a good note. And that's not a good note for,
excuse me, that's nothing new. So why is it that France, over the decades, has always been like this? Why?
It's nothing new, but it's getting more and more severe. And over the past decades, the figures in people in prison have strongly increased, and the overcrowding is increasing. Construction of prisons have been made, but the figures of prisoners are increasing higher than the number of people in prison. I think there's a paradigm where there is too much investment on the punishment dimension and too little on the rehabilitation. And it might be some form of a vicious circle where there is a perception of what the population thinks, and the population has been told you need vengeance, you need harsh situations. And there's a kind of a negative effect where it's difficult to have people understand how decent prison conditions will actually lead to rehabilitation and to lower reoffending rates. So that's important to do, and that's one of the things we're trying to do at Prison Insider, because the figures are going over the roof, and there's a lot of announcement effects. And the more you tell the general public that prison is an answer to insecurity, the more you will convince them that it might be true, whereas no actual academic study has proved the effectiveness of prison on reoffending. So it costs a lot. In France, the amount per prisoner per day is around 120 euros. For that cost, you have people sleeping on the floor, you have insects going through their ears, and they have no activity whatsoever for a whole year or 2 years. And then you expect them to get out and become better citizens, which is something that no other public policy could get away with.
Richard Verly, let me ask you about this, because this very Wednesday, a famous French actor and comedian who was responsible, he was
Pierre Palmade,
under the influence of drugs and alcohol, and involved in a fatal car crash that he caused, got a 2-year sentence. He's out after 5 months with an electronic bracelet. And again, he's out early because he's not a danger to society, probably, but also because those prisons are overcrowded. And your thoughts on
True.
on how it's perceived here.
Well, what was just said is really factual. There is this feeling among the population that the more you put criminals in jail, or just people suspected to be criminals in jail, the more security you have. And look at who are the two ministers in charge at the moment. Bruno Retailleau is the present Minister of Interior. He is a contender for the leadership of the Republican Party, meaning the right, the Conservative Party. And Gérald Darmanin, who is the Justice Minister, used to be the Interior Minister, and he is a presidential hopeful. Both of them have made repression their motto. Everything is about repression. They want to put people in jail. They want more policemen in the streets. They pretend that they will, with this, they will manage to curb down the narco system and so on, which doesn't happen to be the case because more and more narco affairs in France these days. You just open every day a newspaper, you have a narco affair. Either you have a mayor taken to jail because it appears that she or he was corrupted. You have in Le Havre, the harbor, you have cocaine shipment entering and so on and so forth. But I'm not surprised because it's all about repression. Keep in mind that this is a country where around 35% of the voters are in favor of the Rassemblement National, the extreme right. So that weighs a lot on the public and political debate about jail and crime.
Gabriel Stargarder, is this what this is all about? Chasing after the front runner being Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party?
I think there's two big sort of contexts here behind what's going on with these prison attacks. I think the first one, 100%, is that France has been dragged rightward by the rising popularity of Le Pen and her far-right RN party. That is dragging politicians with her. So Darmanin and Retailleau are having to kind of move in lockstep with where the voters are asking them to go. For them, their response is targeting crime, violence, which affects many of these working class RN voters. I think the other context here, though, is that crime and insecurity has deteriorated in France. There's been years of record cocaine shipments into Europe. France has not been spared. You mentioned Le Havre. Just a few weeks ago, there was a 10-ton seizure at the port of Dunkirk.
10 tons.
10 tons. The previous
just in a container, 10 tons of cocaine.
Just to give you the context here, the previous record, which was a few weeks earlier at the port of Le Havre, was 2 tons. To give you an extent of how quickly this is shifting, and this has been going across Europe for a decade now, and this is trickling down. You have these gangs which used to run cities like Marseille or larger metropolis, which are now moving into smaller regional towns, preying on communities which really have no experience of drug violence. They're selling drugs out like capillaries through the country. And this is something that is very real and is affecting voters. And I think that although the mainstream politicians are peddling a more right-wing political line, they are also responding to real changes that are happening in the criminal underworld, not just in France, but across Europe.
Okay, Gabriel, let me ask you about this, because we talked about those two figures. The Justice Minister, Gérald Darmanin, he's been making the round of media outlets the last 3 days, but the Justice Minister has competition. Retailleau, his successor as Interior Minister, who, like Darmanin, hails from Les Républicains party of Nicolas Sarkozy, and he tweeted, "I want to express my support for the prison officers targeted by thugs." Gabriel, your reaction to that language, thugs?
Well, I think it's the language of a government that wants to show that it's getting tough on crime. I mean, I think it's largely quite predictable. I think that the big backdrop to all of this is the 2027 race. I mean, as we saw, Le Pen has now been knocked out of the race by this corruption conviction. The field is wide open on the right. Particularly, it's a competitive field, much more on the centre. So both Retailleau and Darmanin, who working hand in hand on tackling crime and violence in France, in a few months they may be competing for the top job in France. So that's also really lying behind a lot of this.
And before he can run for president, Bruno Retailleau first running for leadership of the Les Républicains party. That's coming up next month. And there's a bit of brinkmanship there. His rival for the post, Laurent Wauquiez, recently calling for offshoring of bad hombres to the French overseas dependency of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, population 5,819, two tiny islands off the coast of Canada's Newfoundland. Its tourism office, playing on the OQTF acronym, it's the France's acronym for Order to Leave the French Territory, turning it into things like We Leave Everything Behind, Your Quest is Family Tranquility, this poster saying there's no overcrowded classrooms, or workers qualified to work in the cold. There's full employment in Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, says this poster. This outsourcing of mass incarceration, Yann Saint-Pierre, that sounds familiar. We've heard that before, and we've heard it more recently from the White House.
Absolutely, and it's a way. In France's case, at least it doesn't fall into this gray area or black hole, legal black hole. What we've saw with in Guantanamo or Diego Garcia, what the British did during the 2000s and early 2010s. It's a different statement, but it has this really old feeling in terms of being sent in exile, right? It feels like a Dumas novel in the sense, being sent to an island prison. It has this sense of Robben Island. Okay, it's too overcrowded. Let's send them across the Atlantic somewhere else. And I think this is something where it's becoming. It's a short-term, again, as I mentioned earlier, a short-term solution that has a terrible long-term effects. Also for the local population. I mean, suddenly you're on a small island like this, you build a major complex like a prison, it changes the vibe. Even in any neighborhood, it changes the vibe. And it's not a permanent solution. I think permanent solutions are more about how do you decrease the prison population in a way where you can still hand on justice, but at the same time manage it in a way where only really convicted criminals for hard crimes, for very serious crimes, are in prison. Does that mean more bracelets, more monitoring? Those are there, but this is a really short-term solution that feels like it was decided 200 years ago.
All right, so mass incarceration, a thing these days. What with we saw Donald Trump this week singing the praises of his Salvadoran counterpart, Nayib Bukele, even asking him to build super prisons for U.S. citizens in that Central American nation where he sent alleged gang members over. Florence Laufert, just to be clear, Laurent Wauquier's suggestion of an offshore prison site in Saint-Pierre and Miquelon is not being taken seriously by the government. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere. But when you see what's going on in the United States, should we perhaps take this a little more seriously than we would have before January the 20th?
Let's be wary of a number of things, because indeed, even pessimistic, we see that terrible things can happen beyond our imagination. I don't think that Laurent Wauquier's suggestion deserves to be taken seriously. And we're talking about migrants, and the OQTF is for migrants. So that's already a first equation with migratory status and some form of criminalization, which is contrary to all international principles. Now, in any case, it's interesting to note that the prisons overseas, in the French overseas territories, have terrible conditions that are way more concerning than the ones in the Hexagon, in the continental France. So there's no way that inventing new detention systems in the overseas could be something positive. Now, in general, it's quite interesting to note this trend of trying to export your prison population, and of course Donald Trump is doing it with his usual announcements. But it's also done in certain European countries that actually decrease their prison populations and then rent prison spaces in other countries. That's very concerning when it comes to the rights, because a country is responsible to implement decent conditions for its prison population. In Europe, you do have the agreements and, in a way, the overseeing mechanisms that could allow you to understand how other countries are treating their prisoners. But when you start exporting your prisoners to other countries, it's the open door to to all kinds of violations of human rights. One of them being already the right to be connected to your loved ones if you're exported to the other end of the planet, as was done, for instance, with a number of Kanak prisoners that were imprisoned in the continental France. Then that's basically preventing you from seeing your loved ones, which no prisoner in any conditions should be submitted to.
Richard Verly, earlier in this conversation, we talk about return of the calls for mass incarceration, like we saw in the U.S. in the 1980s. Now, the return of offshoring, as Yann Saint-Pierre reminds us, it conjures images of the movie Papillon, when the French would send their
the labor camps,
the labor camps on
yes.
Devil's Island and
in French Guyana
and the such. So, what's this all about?
Well, it proves one thing. It proves that the country is the back against the wall when it comes to criminality, when it comes to its justice system, and when it comes also to migration and illegal migration. Because you can't completely dissociate those things. For example, there are around 50,000, I was stunned myself when I look at the figures, around 50,000 Algerian migrants who are supposed to leave the territory. They have been, they have got this OQTF by the Justice Ministry. They are supposed to leave the country, and they do not leave the country. So it doesn't mean that they are at the moment criminals, but they have done something against the law. It may be that they have overstayed or they have worked illegally. It doesn't mean that they have committed a crime necessarily. So the problem is that everything is mixed at the moment. These people are mixed in jail. These people are mixed in jail. And what do you think drug traffickers are doing while they are in jail? They do exactly the same thing as the Islamist radicals are doing. They are hiring new people because they have this labor force there in the French jail, where instead of having 3-person or 2-person per cell, you have sometimes 6 or 7. So that's the perfect, I would say, the perfect gasoline for more violence and for more criminality. Now, the idea of sending this OQTF to Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, I believe Laurent Wauquiez, who also is a contender for the Republican Party, you said it, he just looked at the map, he saw that Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon is in the north, it's very cold, there are some inhabited islands, so I'm going to send them there. Frankly speaking, if I take my Swiss hat, being a bit pragmatic and not at all political, it's going to cost a lot of money if he wants to do that. Building a jail in Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, close to Canada, close to the country of our friend, sending the criminals over there, then having prison guards in Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, it's completely mad. So it proves that when it comes to criminality and the justice system in the country, there is a problem with simple reasoning. We are completely clouded by political goals rather than the need to solve issues.
And that brings us back to the point Gabriel was making earlier. Last year, the amounts of drugs seized in France more than doubled, leading the Interior Minister to describe it as, quote, a white tsunami descending on Europe. Drugs had often come in, but not only, through Belgium and Spain. At the start of last month, you were mentioning that bust in the port of Dunkerque, 10 tons of cocaine seized. Of course, Gabriel Stargarder, it's also because there's a market. People are buying these drugs.
Yeah, but I think there's a question about who is pushing the market, right? I mean, prices of cocaine have fallen or stayed steady for a long time now because of just a massive oversupply. So that's moving the consumer base. It's making it, it's democratizing the user base of a drug which was once associated much more, with a sort of glitzy clientele. And by democratizing it, it's made it much larger, the clientele base. There's been reporting which has shown that modern day cocaine users are now actually people with like working class jobs. So, for example, truck drivers or people in quite
fishermen. I saw a piece on fishermen.
Labor intensive work where they, you need to stay up late, or cooks, chefs in restaurants, things like that. So I think that, basically the user base of the drug has become massive. Prices have fallen, and the gangs, which have got this windfall of white powder, have been very aggressive in searching out new markets in smaller provincial towns.
And in mapping out the response, as Richard was saying, this sort of blurring of the lines over who to go after.
Yeah. And I think the state is really struggling to catch up. Some of these answers. I mean, the Wauquier's example is more to do with migration, which is another major issue that the far right is capitalizing on. But I think what you're seeing with that, and this also relates to the drug trafficking question, is that the right is, and I think you're also seeing this with Trump in the United States, that the right is getting a lot more creative in terms of solutions for tackling these issues. Now, some might call it creative, others might call it diabolical, but they are coming up with ideas that are tackling a scourge, which I think maybe some on the left are still kind of relying on these old paradigms, which are increasingly not working.
Florence Laufer, again, we've just described a global problem, and we've seen countries like Ecuador completely overrun by this problem. And we're feeling this feeling of being overwhelmed, even if it's just a perception. It's certainly feeling like it here in France. So, yeah, how do you reprogram the paradigm? How do you look at this problem differently now?
I think there's an issue that's been mentioned a number of times in this panel, which is political posturing that comes as an answer, as an invented answer, a fictional answer to pragmatic issues and to the need of prevention. And I think drug trafficking also goes along these lines. In the studies we've done in the past months and years, we've seen that in Asia and Latin America, drug dealing is a big part of, and drug offenses are a very important part of the number of people that are imprisoned, which could, at first glance, seem like a response to the problem. But what we see is that those in prisons are only the dealers at the very, very minor scale. We're talking about young people. We're talking about women from female-headed households. We're talking about people from minorities, people that basically have no income, and for who the drug dealing dimension is part of a subsistence strategy. And what's noted in all of these countries, and that's Ecuador, Latin America, but also in Thailand and the Philippines, is that the higher level of drug traffic never actually either gets caught or doesn't go in prison. So that's, again, I think something that says something about the misuse of prison, which could or should be there as an answer to contain serious criminality, but basically comes as an answer, as a knee-jerk answer to major problems that have to do with education levels, with labor, with poverty, with integration principles, but also with healthcare and drug addiction. And all these things should be seen in the picture rather than the first reaction of just imprisoning the ones that basically are also very disempowered, even in those drug trafficking networks.
So Yann Saint-Pierre, we're almost out of time, but on this issue, again, if there's a geographical point at which the problem is highlighted right now, and we've seen it with these attacks, it's penitentiaries, it's prisons. What can be done?
I think it's definitely trying to change the ecosystem in prisons. I think that this is, we've discussed it a lot. It's about moving away from the short-term solution, but really understanding that prisons have their own ecosystems, have their own dynamics that are independent of the formal system itself. And if we keep putting people in those informal dynamics, that informal incubator, we're going to create more problems, and it always comes down to having a boiling pot of water and trying to keep the lid on. And we need to find a way to create outlets. And this comes down with, as Ms. Laufer mentioned, really changing the mentality, changing the approach that we have to sentencing, to the use of prison, but we have to find a way, more importantly, to move it away from the political spectrum and rely on the expertise of prison personnel and their judgment to try to reform the system in a way that's much more efficient.
Yann Saint-Pierre, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Berlin. Florence Laufer in Lyon, Richard Verly, Gabriel Stargarder, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.